Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Concord Free Public Library. My name is Emily Smith, and I am the Library Director. And it is my pleasure to introduce Sherry Litwack, the President of the Concord Free Public Library Corporation, who will do our introduction.
Good evening. I am Sherry Litwack, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Concord Free Public Library Corporation. Let's begin with a little housekeeping. Please note the exit signs around you. Remember to silence your phones, and please do not take any photos during the program. This event would not have been possible without the outstanding efforts of our development staff, Development Director Marcy Booley-Eckel, Manager of Development Sophia Ganem, and Marketing and Communications Manager Emily Labono, as well as our stellar library staff, including Library Director Emily Smith, Head of Technical Services Carolyn Nee, Head of Reference Barbara Guzia, and Curator of Special Collections Anka Voss. And I'd also like to acknowledge the trustees who are here this evening. I couldn't do it without you. Tonight is an historic occasion. We are dedicating the Goodwin Forum named in honor of Richard and Doris Kearns Goodwin. Ralph Waldo Emerson spoke at the library's dedication in 1873. Today, it is an honor to have Doris Kearns Goodwin, one of the most distinguished and beloved Concord authors and historians, speak at the dedication of this special space. In her conversation with Trustee John Boynton, you will learn about the important role that the town of Concord played in the personal and professional lives of Richard and Doris. When we began planning the library expansion over a decade ago, we identified many needs. One of the most pressing was having a large meeting space where people could come together to learn and engage when the library was open, including programs during the day. In the past, we could only have these larger programs when the library was closed or hold them at another location. We wanted it to be a multifunctional, flexible space that could be used for programming, meetings, and collaborative work. However, it became something much more. We realized how important it would be to have a space for civic engagement and discourse, a place where people could respectfully discuss the issues of the day. This gave birth to the idea of naming the space in honor of the Goodwins, to reflect and be inspired by their work in social justice, government, public service, and history. This space honors the Goodwins as distinguished Concord authors and historians in the tradition of Concord's literary and historic heritage. It reflects their work physically and intellectually. On one side of the room, you can see their extensive book collection that was donated by Doris before she moved to Boston. It includes a vast number of their research collection in addition to books that reflect their personal interests. The over 3,000 volumes were inventoried by former library director Barbara Powell and her grandson, Wes, under the direction of Special Collections Curator Anka Voss. You can access the entire collection through an app on your own device or on a special touchscreen in the forum. As Emerson said at the library's dedication, after asking Concord citizens to bring their best books to the library to start the collection, there is no end to the praise of books to the value of the library. On the other side of the room, you can see photographs of Richard and Doris engaging with world political and cultural leaders. A few samples are on display now, but the wall will highlight a rotating exhibit of fascinating photos showing them in the room where it happened, to borrow a phrase from the musical Hamilton. At the front of the room is a quote from a speech that President Lyndon Baines Johnson gave in 1965 to persuade Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act following the reprehensible event at the Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. The speech, known as the We Shall Overcome speech, was written by Richard Goodwin and is considered to be one of the most important presidential speeches of all time. And tonight, I am thrilled to announce that Doris has donated primary source materials from her book, The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, to our special collections, which she wrote longhand in the library's reference room. The Goodwin Forum is truly one of the jewels of the library expansion project. John Boynton is a trustee of the Library Corporation and co-chair of the Connecting Our Community campaign with his wife, Joanna. He understood the vision for this space from the beginning and began having conversations with Doris about what it could be and what it would represent. It would never have come to fruition without his persistent and passionate quest to make it an enduring legacy of the work of the Goodwins tied to the library's mission. And to remind everyone about that legacy, here are a few highlights of Doris's and Richard's careers. Richard Goodwin was an author, playwright, and political advisor and White House speechwriter to Presidents John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson, as well as to Senator Robert F. Kennedy. Early in his career, he was special counsel in the investigation of the quiz show scandal. Late in his career, he wrote the play, The Hinge of the World, about the clash between Galileo and Pope Urban VIII. He was passionate about poetry. One of the highlights of the book collection in the Forum is the collection of his books from his personal study, reflecting his wide range of interests. He never missed a Concord Library book sale. He was truly a Renaissance man. Doris Kearns Goodwin taught government at Harvard University. She was named a White House Fellow in 1967 and was asked by President Johnson to help him write his memoirs. She won the Pulitzer Prize in History in 1995 for No Ordinary Time about Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. In 2005, she wrote the best-selling book, Team of Rivals, The Political Genius of Abraham Lincoln, which was a primary source for Steven Spielberg's film, Lincoln. Other critically acclaimed books include The Bully Pulpit and Leadership in Turbulent Times. She was invited by President Obama, who was inspired by Team of Rivals, to have conversations about history, and particularly the role of presidents in history. As one of the nation's foremost presidential historians, she has appeared as an analyst and commentator on many news programs, often asked to place current events into historic context. It is my great pleasure and distinct honor to introduce Doris Kearns Goodwin.
I hope you all know, we're going to have a conversation, John and I, but I hope John, Sherry, and the Board of Trustees know how much this means to me. It's really an emotional thing to be able to have these books here, and Dick is back, and our beloved Concord is here. It means our life was surrounded by books. They went everywhere with us. We moved from one house to another to have room for the books. Finally, when I decided to move into Boston, it just was kind of too lonely to be in that big house by myself, even though, thank God, Michael was here, my son, and moved in that first year to make that bridge for me. I couldn't bring all my books with me. And there's been so many times this last year when I keep thinking, where is that book? And I realize it's here, and I can come and visit it every now and then. And I just know now that COVID's over and I'll be able to come out to Concord more often, this will always be my heart. I've loved this town so much. So thank you all very much. And I can't wait to talk to John.
I can tell you how excited I am to have Doris here in person, dedicating this grand edition in this room in particular. It really means a lot to us. And if you think about what Sherry said, Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1873, Doris Kearns Goodwin almost exactly 150 years later, it just makes sense, right? It feels good. In fact, Doris, I remember the first time you and I met. It was in 1985. You were living at the corner of Cottage Street and Main Street. My younger brother, Matt, was doing something called Act Tunes, now called Concord Youth Theater, with Michael and Joe Goodwin. And I was asked to go pick him up at their house one time. So I drove by, I knock on the door, I come into the kitchen, and there's Joe Kennedy sitting at the kitchen table. This is Joe Kennedy, the son of Bobby Kennedy and the nephew of President Kennedy. He was introduced to me by Doris as a potential candidate for Tip O'Neill's seat. And I thought, wow, this just seems like it's pretty normal. Like they're just sitting around late in the afternoon, having drinks with a potential congressional candidate. And it occurred to me that this has probably been what a lot of your life has been like. I mean, you've had 60 years of advising presidents, policymakers, other leaders, and it's a pretty amazing life that you've led. And to have you here with this tight connection to Concord means a lot to us. So it's great to have you here. And as you say, we're going to have a conversation. The first question I'd like to ask is, how did you and Dick come to Concord? And what did the 40 years here that you had together mean to you both?
Well, when we first got married and we're trying to figure out where to live, we had a problem because he really wanted to live in the country. He loved the tranquility of the country and nature, and I wanted the excitement of the city. So we kept looking for a place that would be able to satisfy us both, and we found Concord. It was perfect. I mean, as you all know who live near here, it is a country. You cross 128 and you feel like you're in a different world. And at the same time, you can, at least in the days when we were younger, you could get into the city relatively easy. That's less so today. But we've loved this town. I mean, when we first lived on the house and cottage in Main Street, and it was a perfect place to live because it was the house that all the kids would come to. We had a big billiard table and we had a pinball machine. We had a big screen television, and I could come home. Sometimes my kids weren't even there, but a whole bunch of kids were waiting for my kids. And then when we had the Robert Redford pool, we were able to make a pool from the residuals from the movie that Redford made about my husband's quiz show investigation. Then we had the pool for all the kids. And I loved being around the kids all the time. So, but for Dick, most importantly, he just fell in love with his town. And in those last years when he lived, sometimes we'd be coming down Monument Street and he would just say, I love this town. I'm so glad we lived here. There was something about the heritage of the town, obviously for us, the Revolutionary War being here, and then the Transcendentalists, and he could recite those poems. He could recite Emerson. He would drag everybody when they came to visit us to the North Bridge and go through the whole thing. I mean, they have to listen to everything that happened. I remember when we first took the kids to one of those April 19th dedications and recreations, and I remember they were waiting for the good guys, as they called them, to come over the hill. They said, oh, there come the good guys. And Dick loved it. I mean, he was just such a patriot. He had that in his bones, really, in a certain sense. So that was part of it. But it was also partly the friends we made here. You know, because we were writers, we would be home during the day, all day, and then we'd go out at night. And there's a bunch of you guys here that we would go to dinner with at night. One of the restaurants in Concord, we know one night would be a certain bar, another night would be another bar. They'd have Dick's drink ready when we came in. There was a sense of ritual that was connected to this place. So I'm really glad that we ended up here. As I say, I went back to the city, and it was really hard, to be honest, at the beginning because I moved there right before COVID. So there was that sense of a loss of community. Luckily, my other son, Joey, lived a couple floors away from me, and he had a little baby that we watched grow from 1 to 4 during this period of time. But it was still pretty lonely, and I miss this place so much. So be able to, and I love where I am. I live in a hotel, so there's a concierge and there's a doorman, and that's a big family, and it's right in the middle of the city, and it's right for me at my age. But nothing will ever be like Concord was. So I'm glad we chose this place, and we're not living too far out in the country, and that we had all those years before the city.
That's great. Now, the library, I love the story, the fact that you actually wrote the Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys in this library. I mean, in this day and age, I don't think anybody writes freehand anymore, let alone an entire book, right? When did you first begin to appreciate and fall in love with libraries?
Well, I think I fell in love with libraries when I was a little girl because I grew up in Rockville Center, Long Island, and my mother had had rheumatic fever when she was a child. So she was left with a very serious heart condition, even when I was young, had a series of heart attacks, and was really pretty much constrained to live in our house. but she read books in every spare moment she could find, and books took her to those worlds that she could no longer travel to. And I was able to go to the library in my town with her adult card and get books for her. And it was so exciting to go into that library and turn left into the adult section instead of right into the children's section. I somehow felt sleeker and wiser and older. And I remember in those days still, when you took out books in those days, they would have some of you may remember, a card on the back that would be affixed to it, and you could see who had taken it out before. And you'd see a whole bunch of people. I remember if it was hardly anybody that had taken it out before, I'd feel so bad for that person that nobody else had taken that book out. And if a lot of people had taken it out, I felt good about it. And it was a kind of a small library, but I think that's where I fell in love with libraries, just to be able to bring those books home to my mother, bring them back to my mother. And every night she would read to me. So that's where I think I learned the love of books. I've told people the story sometimes that even more important than reading a book with her would be, I would ask her stories about the days when she was young and healthy before her illness had set in, because then I could imagine her jumping rope or climbing the stairs two at a time. So I would constantly say to her, "Mom, tell me a story about you when you were my age," not realizing how peculiar it was until I had my own 3 sons. Never once have they said to me, "Mom, tell us a story about you when you were our age." But somehow I think the love of books, even though my mother died when I had just turned 15, the love of books became the anchor of my life ever since.
Amazing, amazing. And with regard to the Fitzgeralds and Kennedys in particular, can you just describe what it was like to come down here every day? And, you know, were there other regulars? Where did you sharpen your pencils? I mean, what was it like to write a book here?
Well, the best thing was that we had somebody that could help take care of the kids, but they were young then. And I started the book, I guess, in like 78, 79. And then it lasted until 85, 86. It was published in 87. It took a long, long time. I've told the story sometimes, remembering that I had been teaching at Harvard. I stopped teaching when I had the kids, and I was writing. That's all I was really doing. The second book, the Lyndon Johnson book, had already been published. And I heard some kids, and so I hadn't been out in public very much. I'd just been taking care of the kids and writing this book, taking an endless time to write it. And I heard some kids when I was at Harvard Square one time saying, "Whatever happened to Doris Kurtz anyway? Did she die?" So anyway, I had boys. That's what happened to me. I wanted to hit them and say, "That's what happened to me." So what was great about the library was that I could have stayed I had a study in our house. I could have stayed there, but then it would have been harder for the kids to not be allowed to come in and see you. So if you go out in the morning and you come back at a certain point, then finally they don't miss how long you've been gone. So I would come in the mornings. My husband worked at home, and I had my page. I didn't type. I just wrote longhand. There was this particular place in one of those long tables that I always sat at. There was a ritual. You could leave everything there. You could walk around. You could come back. It was like having the most gorgeous study in the world. Could you imagine having that reading room with all those statues around you? And then as we were remembering, sometimes my husband would call up and they'd just answer the phone and he'd say, "Can you tell her it's time to come home for lunch?" And sometimes the kids might call in the afternoon, "What snacks are we having?" So it was an amazing experience. Yes, there were a few regulars who were there, and they'd be sitting over in the carols, and you'd sort of nod to each other, and sometimes they'd come over and see what you were doing. But it was just, it meant a huge amount. It got me through that hump of when you feel like you're no longer the same person when suddenly you have 3 kids and you had none before, and then you're trying to be a professional writer at the same time. So the Concord Library is really where that happened.
Yeah, amazing. And you were writing here, and I mean, in this day and age, it seems like most research is done online, right? I don't know how much research actually happens in libraries anymore, but how did your research work? Because there was a lot of exhaustive research going to 7 books, obviously. Had to do a lot of work. What role did libraries play in that? Oh,
well, I mean, after that book, I did a lot of research at the Kennedy Library, but all the books have taken me to the libraries of the guys that I've lived with, which means the presidents that I've lived with. Mm-hmm. I sometimes do call them my guys because I feel like I've spent so much time with them, more time with them than anybody else except for my husband. So what was great about the old days is that, and probably it's easier now in the digital world, but there was something about going to those libraries. Like, for example, when I went to the Roosevelt Library, and I don't know whether Linda's here, who worked for me for all my life, almost as a research assistant, and was the best. And she and I would drive to the Roosevelt Library, 3 hours and 45 minutes. Then we stayed at a motel there. We'd come back. And all you did when you went into the library, you could only bring in a pencil. You had to leave your pocketbook, everything outside, because you're dealing with the primary materials. You have a catalog, and they bring you the materials, and then you write down on a sheet what you want copied. And then they would copy it for you, and you'd pay them, obviously, to do that, and it would come weeks later. So think about the difference now. When you get something online, you have it automatically. But on the other hand, when they brought you, you thought you wanted a particular speech or something, they'd bring you a box, and then you look in the whole box, and there's a lot of other stuff in it that you wouldn't have thought was it. It's the same way when you go to a library versus buying a book online. You go to a library, you see the book next to it was the one you really wanted, and you didn't know that. And the same time, then you'd go into the newspaper room where you could have the microfiche. And I can remember I would start knowing that I wanted a certain article, and I'd be reading that, but then in the bottom of the page, the same page I was reading, the history thing, would be a murder story that was going on. And I start reading that. And then I start thinking, will you stop this? You wonder, why do your books take so bloody long? you have no way of doing this. So there was a difference. I mean, I don't know what it's going to be like for historians. I mean, I relied on diaries, on letters, handwritten letters that they would write to their wives or their mothers or their girlfriends or their spouses. And there's something about those letters that if you now knew you wanted a certain passage from the digital thing, you would get that, but you wouldn't see the whole string of it. And people aren't going to be writing letters the same way. They'll be writing emails. They'll have tweets that we may read 100 years from now. I don't know what it's going to be like. You're going to have much more information if I were an historian 100 years from now. I never saw my guys walking and talking. Well, finally, I did with Teddy a little bit in FDR, but certainly not with Lincoln. Now you'll be able to see them in 3 dimensions. You'll be able to know what their voice sounded like. When we were working on the movie on Lincoln, the only way we knew that Lincoln had a high-pitched voice was because of somebody who had written about it. They'd heard him speak. And so they hear he has a high-pitched voice. And so when Daniel Day-Lewis played him with a high-pitched voice, and he couldn't have spoken that way, it should have been a baritone voice. But they knew, because in those days when you spoke to a group of people outside, there'd be 10,000 people that would come to the debates between Douglas and Lincoln. And if you had a baritone voice, as Stephen Douglas did, it would be great for the crowd right here. But the high-pitched voice went over the crowd, so it went to the back of the crowd. So that's why we knew that. It's the only way. But it was just a wonderful thing to have that tactile sense. When I was working on the Roosevelt book, they had an usher's diary that kept every day everything that Eleanor and Franklin did that day. So you'd see what time they woke up in the morning, who they had breakfast with, who they had lunch with, who they had meetings with, who came over for dinner at night, who came to their famous cocktail hour parties. And then if you knew that, you could look at the memoirs of the people who'd been there. You could see Eleanor's daily columns to see what she wrote about. It allowed you I copied every single one of those from 1940s to 1945. People had used the big ones like Pearl Harbor or an important day. But for me, trying to get a sense of what their daily life was like, that turned out to be an invaluable source. So I think the sources that we had in the old days, I'd still rather be writing about those characters in the past with those real primary sources than doing it digitally. But in terms of equal opportunity, I was lucky enough to be able to go to those libraries for weeks at a time. For people who can't do that, to be able to do it online, it's an extraordinary thing. So there's much more information that's available to more people now. And to that, I think it's a wonderful thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, progress is not always clear whether we're making progress or not, right? I think your point about we still have the same kind of primary sources in terms of journals and everything else is a very good one. Let's talk about your books for a minute, because you mentioned in your opening comments that one of the reasons you moved several times was to accommodate a growing collection of books. I remember when we first started talking about this idea, you were very concerned about the move to Boston because you're moving into a much smaller place and you weren't going to have the same capacity for books. And so actually finding a home for those books meant a lot to you. What can you tell us about your collection?
Yeah, well, my husband started collecting books, not just books that he read, but he loved books. And so everywhere we'd go to bookstores and he'd buy books. And then there were all the things that we both kept. I kept many of the books that I had from the time I was teaching. So when we finally got into the house in Monument Street, the house in Main Street had libraries too in it. But we've outspaced that. And in fact, the reason we were moving was in part because we needed a new space for the books. And the Historic District Commission was going to make a decision about whether we could build a 2-story library or not onto our Main Street house. I think they might have let us do it, but if any of you know, it was taking a long, long time. So, and I'm glad they do, but you've had relationships too.
Yeah.
So while they were waiting to decide whether the doorknob could be what it was or there could be that many windows that it was, we decided, why don't we just look? Because we were going to have a 2-story library that was like a big barn thing. And so maybe there's a house with a barn that will have room for our books. And we found 1640 Monument Street. And I just fell in love with it the minute I saw it. And then we came back and we decided to buy it. And then, of course, I thought, why am I doing this? I've loved this house on Main Street. The kids were born here. They were born here, but they were grown up here. I don't want to move. And, of course, then we moved. And it turned out to be incredibly wonderful for us because the barn became one thing, but we built onto that house to make room for the books. There was a huge great room already with a big fireplace, and that became our fiction room. And it was all organized. I mean, we had it from authors, the authors' names from A to Z, and then the literary critics at the end. And then the dining room had a collection of books in it. Every room had books in it. The kitchen even had books in it. And then but there still wasn't room. The hallways had presidential books in it. One study had baseball in it. Another study had Dick's poetry and drama in it. But there still wasn't room. So we built a whole new room that had been a 3-car garage, became a 3-car library. And then my husband needed a tower somehow because he liked Nathaniel Hawthorne's tower. So up goes the tower. And on the top, there was a little room where you could sit if you bring a book, if we ever went up the spiral staircase. And then that became the biography room. And then Lincoln formed a whole wall of that room. So the Wall Street Journal did an article of houses at times, and they did an article on our house of books. And the headline was, Lincoln is in a garage. So anyway, it was just wonderful to have. It really was a house of books, and it made it so special. Books are such an extraordinary, I think they're beautiful, that as a decoration in the house. So to have every room filled with books, and they really looked beautiful as well. I felt aesthetically surrounded by them, as you would by pieces of art.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of people here can relate to that feeling about books. In fact, a number of your fiction books made their way to the one of the book sales here. And
embarrassingly, because many of those kitchen books were probably cooking books, which I didnn't use very much.
No, but the nonfiction all made its way into the special collections, but the fiction we decided was not quite as unique. And so you wouldn't imagine how thrilled many people were to be buying something from the Doris Goodwin Library. So that was great.
No, that's true. I think the travel books were there. There were a collected group of books. That's exactly right.
Yeah. I don't want to put you on the spot, but this library has very few rooms named for anybody. We have a room called the Thorough Room, and this is really only the second room that has a name on it, the Goodwin Forum. Dick passed away in 2018. I'm wondering if you can imagine what this might have meant to him.
Well, I think that when you write about people that we do and work with presidents, there's always that sense that you want to leave something behind. All the guys that I wrote about were thinking about that. Lincoln, from the time he was young, wanted to accomplish something so that his story could be told after he died. And Teddy Roosevelt wondered what would happen to you after you die, and he thought, well, maybe it didn't really matter because people would forget you after 1,000 years, but you wanted your kids and your family and the people who knew you to remember. And Lyndon Johnson had a heart attack when he was in his 40s, and all of a sudden he woke up after being really in a state of depression for days after that heart attack. And he said, I'm ready now. Get me going. Let's go. I got to get shaven. I've got to get to work. And I said, well, what happened? He said, well, I was lying here and I was thinking, what if I died now? What would I be remembered for? So I think, Dick will be remembered for this. There's no question about that. Not just that speech, but the extraordinary public voice that he gave to key moments in history. In fact, I'll never forget when I first met him. He came to Harvard. I was teaching there, and he came to have a room to finish one of his books because he knew the Kennedy family. And I'd heard about him. I had already worked for Lyndon Johnson. I was a young assistant professor at the time, but Dick was more famous for sure. And I knew that he'd been somewhat arrogant. He was mercurial, and he was brilliant, and that he had worked and been with Kennedy and Johnson, been with Bobby Kennedy when he died. And he comes into the room. We're all excited that he's going to come, Institute of Politics. And I'm up in my office, And then he just comes in one day and plops down. And he says, well, are you a graduate student? I said, no, I'm just a professor. And I tell him all the courses I'm teaching. He, of course, knew. He was just teasing me. So anyway, we went out to dinner that night, and we talked. We talked about Kennedy and Johnson, about baseball. He was a Red Sox fan as well. Just a conversation that went on for the rest of our lives, many ways. And I came home, and two friends of mine were staying at my house. I was living in Cambridge, of course, at the time. And I said, I met the man I want to marry. And I felt that way right away, and it took a while, but it finally worked out. And there were 42 years, and we were together for 45 years. But I realized that if I go back in time to this speech that he wrote, the We Shall Overcome speech, we both met several times without ever really knowing that we were meeting each other. We were both at the March on Washington in 1963, and there was only 250,000 other people between us, so no wonder we didn't meet. But that march meant an enormous amount to me. I mean, it meant that you were part of that civil rights movement. It was an extraordinary feeling to be a part of something larger than yourself. And I think it had a huge effect on me wanting to be involved in social justice through writing, if not through action, the same way he was. And if I had ever known, being in that march, and then I was in graduate school at Harvard at the time when the Selma demonstrations took place, and the people, including John Lewis, who were brutally attacked by the vicious police force there, watching that all on the screen, and then Lyndon Johnson deciding a week later he was going to give a speech to get voting rights passed through the Congress. And if I'd ever realized when I was listening to that speech with my friends in graduate school that I would end up 2 years later working for Lyndon Johnson, the man who delivered that speech, or, more importantly, marrying Richard Goodwin, the man who crafted that speech, I would not have believed it. It just, these ways, these things happen. And what's so important about that speech, which is up here right now, is it's Concord is in it. It starts out as if Dick knew that he was going to end up living here. You know, history and fate meet at a certain time in a certain place. So it was in Lexington and Concord. So it was at Appomattox. So it was in Selma, Alabama. This is not a Negro problem, not a white problem, not a Northern problem, not a Southern problem. It is not a moral problem. There is nothing that could be right about denying your fellow Americans the right to vote. We have to remember this right now, right today. And then he said, but he goes on and he says, it's an American problem. We're all met here to meet that problem. And then he does something which is extraordinary. It's when change takes place in this country. He said, you know, if we continue on, and there's more things that have to be done than this, but if we work toward it, we shall overcome, which means he's taking the anthem of the civil rights movement, the outside force, the energy, the vitality, the bravery, the courage of that outside force, and bringing it to the highest channels of power, the presidency of the United States. When those things happen, that's when change takes place in this country. It was the anti-slavery movement, Lincoln said, that did it all, not Lincoln. You know, it was the progressive movement that was underneath Teddy Roosevelt in the cities, in the settlement houses. It was the union movement under FDR, and of course the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the gay rights movement, the environmental movement now. And when those things come together, power and that movement, that's when change takes place. And that's what's represented here in this room. And I think it's much larger even than these words. It's what this room can be for citizens to know that they have the power to change things. And that's what's really exciting about this place.
I love that. It is amazing. It's powerful. So many of us have read your books. We have, you know, we're aware of all these amazing things that kind of you projected to the outside world. My wife and I work together, and I know that it's not always easy working with your spouse. I'm just curious. You know, it all looks great from the outside. What was it really like to work with Dick on a daily basis?
Oh, he was the easiest guy in the world. No way. No, we got into a routine. I mean, I luckily would wake up earlier than him. This is all when the kids are gone. I mean, when the kids are there, your life is your kids, right? And that's probably similar whether you work together or not. But the fact that we were partners in work made a difference. So I would wake up early, usually at 5:30 in the morning. I've finally gotten back to that routine again. When I first moved into Boston again, I lost the routine. I would stay up too late, and I wasn't working early in the morning. It was part of that feeling of a loss of ritual. But it was great to have, to be honest, those two or 3 hours before Dick comes roaring down the stairs, singing down the stairs. Our best friend, Michael Rothschild, here, and he knows so well what it was like to know Dick, just at the top of the stairs. Beth Lasky knows that too. He'd just start singing as he came down. The shaving cream is half on his face still, and here I am, I'm coming. So breakfast better be ready. So meanwhile, I'd gone out and gotten the newspapers. You'd bring them in and be ready at the table for him. Not that I could cook breakfast. That was the one thing I could do pretty well. And we'd read the newspapers together, but I'd already had 2 or 3 hours of work on writing all by myself. It was so great. And then this lion comes down the stairs. And so we would have breakfast together. And then often we'd go off to our own studies. His was on one side of the house. Deb is here, who worked with him in those last years. And mine was on another side of the house. And then we'd come back together for lunch. And look at, and when I was writing Lincoln, he'd be great, especially on Lincoln. He loved Lincoln so much that he would read what I wrote, and he could edit it right there. I read everything he wrote. Then he would often spend times in the afternoon before he was working on his papers, which was the last couple of years, just reading. As anybody who knows him knows, he had an eclectic sense of taste. As was said by Sherry, he'd be reading about quarks, or he'd be reading about black holes, things that I couldn't even understand if he tried to help me understand them. And then he'd be reading poetry, and he'd be reading history, and he'd be reading fiction. And they were all piled up on his chair, and he'd just pick one after the other. And then at the end of the day, because we'd both been home working all the time, as I said earlier, we went out to dinner at night, almost every night after the kids were grown. And again, to have that regular group of people that you knew you'd meet at a various place, whether it was Karma or Fiorella's or the Colonial Inn or Woods Hill, we'd all meet there and then come home. And we went to bed pretty early, about 10:30 or so. And so then I could get up at my 5:30 time, 10:30 or 11. So the ritual of having a writer in the house and having him be an editor for me, and I was able to help him on everything he did, and never feeling a sense of competition about it, feeling a sense of joy. I think one of the happiest times of my life was when his play, The Hinge of the World, was produced in England. We went every single day. The kids were all over there. Our friends came to visit. And to know how happy it made him to see his work on stage, even more exciting maybe than seeing a president deliver your words. As he said later, I can make my characters say whatever I want them to. I'm creating them. So it was a happy time in his life. And I know how happy he felt for me when things went well. It was certainly a complicated marriage. He was an incredible character. I somehow never was upset by those cigars he smoked all the time. Luckily, I don't know why, but there they were. His cigars and his Gibsons were part of his life. As I said, when we go into the restaurants, they'd know a Gibson is a martini with onions instead of olives, and they all knew he loved that, so it would be waiting for him when he got in. And it was a very rich, extraordinary life. I was very lucky. I mean, that's the one thing that even though, any of us are getting older and you may lose a spouse, to be able to know that you had that many years together, and the kids are great. So it was a wonderful thing.
That's great. You talked about the fact that you were both in and around the White House in the 1960s. So the span of history that you've participated in, kind of experienced, written about, observed, is longer than most, and you've been closer to it than many. To some of us, it feels like we are in, truly unprecedented times, and the degree of polarization we're experiencing right now is really just, I feel, brutal. I'd be curious, what's your perspective on where we are today relative to where we've been in the past? And the follow-on question would be, do you think that a place like this forum has a role to play in trying to bring people together?
Yeah, it's interesting because in the last years of Dick's life, we started working on going through these boxes that he had saved, everything, 350 boxes that schlepped with us everywhere we went, that carried him through his entire life, from Tufts to Harvard Law School to the quiz show investigation to Kennedy to Johnson to McCarthy campaign to Bobby Kennedy to Jackie Kennedy's friendship. And it's a time capsule of the 60s, essentially. And so what happened is, as we started going through the boxes, I was reliving that decade. And I think we make a mistake when we look at the 60s and we think about 1968 and the killing of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King and the riots in the streets and the anti-war violence. Such extraordinary things happened during that decade at the same time. voting rights, civil rights, Medicare, aid to education, NPR, PBS, immigration reform, National Arts and Humanities Foundation. Social justice was at a peak in many ways at that time. So I look back on these moments that are the difficult times in our history, and you have to realize that we've come through them before. I mean, that's constantly what I try to talk to when I'm on television, not to be a pundit, but to talk about the fact that we feel like we're in the worst of times right now. And they are tough. They're as tough as any time that I've had in my lifetime, I think our country is in. And yet we've come through these other times, whether it was the Civil War, the Depression, or the early days of World War II, when it wasn't clear we could beat Hitler. And we've come through with greater strength. So I think it's got to give us hope right now. And I think the great hope here in some ways, when you connect that to the forum, is that we've just got to be able to talk to each other. I mean, I know, my son Michael and course he created at Harvard, at Concord, Rivers and Revolution, brought people from different parts of from Boston to Concord into a sense of collective identity so that they could talk about themselves, they could talk about what they were doing, they worked collaboratively. And that's what you really want us to do as a nation again. Teddy Roosevelt warned that democracy would be at risk if people in different sections or parties began to think each other as the other rather than as common American citizens. And that's what's happened to us in this country right now. So that if we can make in this forum a place where people can find a sanctuary to be able to really tell their honest opinions about things, disagree with each other, and not be afraid in a certain kind of sense that they won't be listened to. You can only begin to do it in a place like this, and then it grows, and then maybe, when I try to think sometimes of if I could do one thing for the country, if I had, and I still am arguing for it right now, it would be a national service program. I just think the idea of taking kids from high school before they go to college or vocational school, take them from the country and go to the city to go to the country, an internal Peace Corps where they learn other ways of life and they learn to respect it. It's what the military does so well, and yet in a civilian form it would be so great. But we can do that in a miniature here, by just being able to have people feel when they come in. Something works when you're able to do that. I can see my son Michael's face right now, and he knows when I was walking around, well, he may not know this, but I would walk around Concord in those last years when we were here, and people would say, you used to be important, but my kid had your kid. So that's what happens when you've got a teacher that's able to create that sense in a classroom of safety so that the kids could really speak their minds. And I know they did. They talked about what they felt living in the city as a Metco kid, living here as a Concord kid. So that's the real hope of what we can. There's a lot you can do in a space like this, surrounded by these words, surrounded by this civil rights, voting rights. One of the most important things that happened in our country to give that right to vote finally after so many years.
I think you're exactly right. And it's the space, it's the books, but I think it's also the people, right? So in some ways it becomes incumbent upon all of us to make this vision happen, right? But I'm so glad to hear you share those inspiring words about what's possible, because it's more important now than ever, I think. You're right. All right, I've got time for one more question for you, then we'll do a little Q&A, but my last question for you has to do with the Red Sox. It's been your love for baseball is well known. Love for the Red Sox is well known. It's been a very tough season, but a very good century for the Red Sox, I'd say. Why do you love baseball so much?
Oh, it goes so far back. It was originally the Brooklyn Dodgers. When I was only 6 years old, my father taught me, as some of you know, that mysterious art of keeping score while listening to baseball games, so that when he went to work in New York during the day, I could record for him the history of that afternoon's Brooklyn Dodger game. And if you're only 5 or 6 years old and your father makes you feel you're so special by telling him this history, a history of a game that took place only a few hours before, it makes you feel there's something magic about this game. In fact, I'm convinced that I learned the narrative art from those nightly sessions, because he never told me then that all of this was actually described in great detail in the sports pages of the newspapers the next day. So I thought I was giving him a history that he would never even know. And I learned that you had to tell a story from beginning to middle to end, because at first when he'd come home, I would blurt out, the Dodgers won or the Dodgers lost, which took the drama of this 2-hour telling away. So I learned you tell a story from beginning to middle to end. So that's where it all began. And I think that's true of so many people, whether a hobby that they share, whether it's a sport or some sort of hobby with a parent. You feel like you've been able to get a love with that parent through something you share, and then you give it to your kids, and then they give it to their kids. We took my grandson, 4-year-old Alexander Sasha Goodwin, to his first Red Sox game just last week, and he sat through about 5 innings. It was pretty incredible, jumping around when he was supposed to be singing, and I just kept thinking, oh, maybe this little boy will carry through what has happened to me. Well, then, of course, when the Dodgers abandoned us and went to California, I couldn't even watch baseball for a couple of years until finally I came to Harvard and went to Fenway Park, so reminiscent of Ebbets Field that I became an irrational Red Sox fan. And as you know, I mean, this character, why don't you tell them about you and baseball and what you had at your house?
You're talking about the mini monster.
Yeah. They did have a replica of the Breen monster. We used to buy it all the time.
We used to put, we had something we called the mini monster on the front porch over our house on Elm Street. And every night we would put up the score of the Red Sox game, showing runs, hits, and errors. And we had the standings off on the right side. It just showed the Red Sox relative to the Yankees. We didn't care about anybody else. And we happened to live in the historic district at that time. And somebody had the audacity to write a letter to the Historic District Commission asking that we take the sign down.
It was devastating.
And Dave Robichaux, Concordian and television personality, found out about it, and he came and he did a story about it. So we were on the news, and the kids were talking about why it meant so much to them, and then there's like this explosion of signs around town, you know, yard signs, save the mini monster, let the scoreboard stay, we love the monster. So we ended up getting permission, special permission to have that sign up on 2 conditions. One was that it had to come down within 7 days of the end of the season, whenever that was. And secondly, we couldn't put up scoreboards for the Celtics, Patriots, or Bruins.
It was great.
So, yeah,
it was great. Yeah. You know, I'll just say one other thing about baseball. The older I've gotten, and you mentioned it, you know, we have had a great century, the Red Sox. So I'm not as crazy as I was when they were never winning and every year they would lose. I mean, I used to really wake up sad if they'd lost the night before. I couldn't read the newspaper if they'd lost the night before. And I was in a sort of sad mood. And my husband would say to me, what's the matter with you? You love your work. You love your family. This is a game. And somehow it was more than a game until they finally won in 04. I mean, it just, every year when they would lose to the Yankees, it was just so painful. But maybe it was good. You got through adversity, and then you get these wins in this century. And I'm not nuts about it. I mean, I think it was craziness. I do think there was something wrong with me. But now, as long as I can go to the games and enjoy them, and as long, this season doesn't help because you want them to have more wins than losers and have a good season. And that I keep saying I'm mature enough that that's all I need. They don't have to win at the other end, but they have to do a little better than they've done this season to be happy. But anyway, it's a wonderful sport, you know, and I was so glad to pass it on to my kids and know that my father's still alive as a result. He died when I was in my 20s too, so both these 2 important people in my lives, one gave me this love of baseball, the other love of books, and they're part of my life, and they're part of here too, so it's pretty exciting.
Thank you. All right, I think we have time for a few questions. And Marcy, do you have a mic?
Yes.
Okay, so what we're going to do is if you'd raise your hand, Sophia will bring the mic to you, because otherwise the people who are watching on Zoom won't be able to hear the question. Then we got a question all the way in the back.
Taking my steps. If I understood you correctly, when you were talking, if I understood you correctly, when you were talking about Lincoln and the anti-slavery movement and Johnson and the civil rights movement, you talked about how an outside movement became truly successful and impactful when it's brought in by the executive of the country. Now, by the same token, what would you say about what Trump did with his supporters during his administration?
I don't know how to answer that, to be honest. I mean, I think what I was talking about, I'll just without getting into ideology right now of what's happened with President Trump, is that the movements that I was talking about all were arguing for a greater social justice. And I think that's the arc of justice that Martin Luther King talked about, and that the people have been able to move that movement forward and move us in a direction that's closer to the ideals of what our country is for. Whether people support President Trump for what he stood for when he was president, there's no connection with what happened on January 6th and those people who thought they were supporting him to attack the Capitol and to do what they did in the name of nothing that had to do with social justice. So I think there's a difference in that, whether one agrees with other statements that Trump might have made.
Thank you.
I don't mean other statements, so.
Okay, right here.
Hi. So as a pseudo-historian who watches younger historians, what would you say to the young female right now who is diving into oral histories and recording stories? What would you say to her as like, hey, here's your little bit of advice?
And that's you, the younger female historian. Yay!
Not that young.
I would say, I think oral histories are great. I think it's, again, that's something that technology is making more possible when you could record people's voices and you have those oral histories from the days when we had radio, and now you have oral histories transcribed, and it's easier to do with phones, et cetera, et cetera. There's something about, I know when I was working on Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt and the home front during World War II, the oral histories of women who worked in the factories was one of my favorite sources of all. I mean, they would talk about what it was like to have a job of their own for the first time. Their husbands are overseas. They're actually making money, and we have a check, and I can do something with it. I'm making a ship, and I feel like I've done something to master during the day. I'm loving working this collaboration. And then the oral histories talk about when the guys come home, and the guy says, what are you doing writing a check? You're not supposed to be handling any of this money. You know, I was a little twig when he left, and now I'm a giant oak. What's going to happen to us? And some of them made it through and some didn't. There's something about, I think if you can collect oral histories, any primary sources for historians, young or old, is, as I said, is gold. It's what you can contribute because you're doing and giving it, whether it's a family that you're recording or somebody's in a line of work that you're recording, it'll be there forever. And then those people will die out, but you've got them on record. I'd say if that's what you're working on as a young historian now, that's the best. Just keep doing what you're doing. It's great.
Excellent. Question all the way up here, Sophia.
So, getting back to the contemporary situation, I'm curious as to what you think about why this has happened. Is this not a failure of democracy itself, that there has been this continual underground, until very recently, alienation of so big a portion of the country, so many people, and not to have somehow taken account of that, taken that into consideration, even as we talk about social justice and so on and so forth. Why has this happened, do you think?
It's a very fair question, and one that, you know, probably needs a complex answer, but clearly you're absolutely right that there's been a source of alienation for many decades. I mean, my husband wrote columns for the LA Times in the 1980s where he talks, one of them, the headline was, "Democracy is in peril with the middle class squeeze," with the elites that were growing from the rich and the poor. I mean, democracy's been in peril at other times, and there are echoes to this time. The turn of the 20th century is I think, the most relevant time, because what you had was the Industrial Revolution shook up the economy, much like the tech revolution and globalization have done today. You had then, for the first time, this huge gap between the rich and the poor, which we have now. Big companies swallowing up small companies. You had people at the turn of the 20th century who lived in the country feeling very suspicious of people in the city. You had a real sectional divide between the East and the West, and immigrants were pouring in from abroad. And there were all these new technologies that made people scared. The automobile, the submarine, the telephone, the telegraph. They made change of life seem very fast. All of that is so replicated now. And the people then who were living in the country felt a sense, you think of William Jennings Bryan, that somehow those people on the East are all taking advantage of me. education system has not kept up, so that there's been a sense of people who have not been able to go to college and not been able to feel they have a fair shot at life and the expense of what college means. The media has obviously exacerbated things by having facts that are not even agreed upon, much less opinions. And I think that's been a real divisive force, obviously. We've had that in the 19th century when you had partisan newspapers, but that didn't end up so well with the Civil War, obviously. So there's been an undercurrent of people feeling that they don't have a shot at life, fairness. And if you don't have fair, and that's what Teddy Roosevelt was able to talk about. He talked constantly about a square deal for the rich and the poor, the capitalist and the wage worker. And he went around the country and he gave speeches in the same speech in every section of the country in order to knit that country somehow back together again, and rational reform for the Industrial Revolution without being socialist on one hand or conservative on the other. And somehow we haven't had that capacity to knit the people back together again. And it is a scary thing, and it certainly was what happened in the 1850s. And if we were to go down that path, then we're really in trouble, and sometimes it feels like we are. But on the other hand, you know, what history again always tells us is that those people living in that time, they didn't know how it was going to end, just like we don't know either. But we still have the chance to write our own chapter right now. It's not over. The battle for democracy is a struggle, more than we thought in other times. And it's happening around the world. I mean, there's something connecting us to Brexit, to these other countries that have moved toward dictators, because there's a sense of fairness was not issued to them and that they felt left out of it for good or bad reasons. So how we deal with it is social, it's economic, it's political. I think the whole question of our political system may need some shaking up. You know, I sometimes wonder whether we should ever have had the primary system. I know it's a more democratic thing than not having it, but somehow it brings out the extremists and more than it does people that can moderate situations. Obviously, gerrymandering is a problem. The Electoral College is a problem. It's still not a majority of the people who feel the way the majority of the people feel. I think the majority of the people want fairness in this country, and I think we still have faith in them, but the minority have a voice, and it's an alienated voice, and it's a difficult thing. It's going to be a while before this sorts itself out.
Laura, do you have a question?
Thank you so much for sharing your library with this Concord community. We are so grateful to you. And I was wondering, you mentioned that you had a fiction collection and that went its own way. How did reading literature and fiction influence you as a historian and a nonfiction writer?
It's a great question. You know, I think one of the things that Teddy Roosevelt said are that books are the greatest companions, and what you need to be a leader, I'm always writing about leaders, is to understand human nature. And there's no better place to understand human nature than in the great works of fiction or poetry or drama. And I think that's true. I mean, I think somehow, for example, I used to read when I went to bed at night just wanting an escape, mystery books. But in the last years, maybe it's because I'm getting older now, I want to be able to read good novels when I go to bed at night. It takes me a long time because I read 20 minutes and fall asleep. But that's what you're supposed to do. But just even in this last couple years, I'm reading Pat Conroy right now, and I read The Prince of Tides because it juggles time, which is something I need to do in the book that I'm writing right now, to go from the 1960s to when I'm opening the books with my husband to when I'm talking about it now when he's no longer there. And so I've been reading, you know, When the Crawdads Sing, Prince of Tides, Great Santini, Sophie's Choice, any of these books that do that. So it really helps to be able to see what a narrator does and how they can have control of the situation to talk and how you can bring things back and forth. But I think mostly it's just a matter of understanding human nature. And when you're writing biographies, as I am, it's the most important thing to try and be able to, what is my character about? What's the foundation of their personality? What are their traits of leadership? And leadership is in everyday life. It's not just in these places in Washington. So to be able to read great novels and write, I wish I knew poetry better. I'd love to. That's what my husband had, a sense of rhythm in his writing, and I think it came from loving poetry so much, because the lines of the poet, I can never remember these things. I don't have that kind of memory that I can recite long poems the way he could. And I wish I could, because when it gets in your head, I think it would help you write a rhythmic sentence in a way. I think one of the things that worries me about university education now, as I read about it, is that history is going down, literature is going down, that press on having a job in science is understandable. But I think the arts and humanities are such an important thing for young people to have for the rest of their lives. And it's also just, it makes you feel better to be reading great literature. So that was the biggest room in our house. and Dick's favorite books. That's just my voice.
Sophia down here, Karen's the question.
Steps in. I was just wondering, I'm kind of curious, how do you decide on the person for the biography? And are you working on something now? Does somebody come up and sort of tap you on the shoulder and say, you haven't written about me yet, it's time?
No, what happens is that, well, first book I wrote, of course, came from the experience of knowing Lyndon Johnson and of, a little more. I talk too much. I'm not even sure I would have been a presidential historian had it not been for that experience of working for Lyndon Johnson, helping him on his memoirs and living down at that ranch and getting to know him in the end of his life. And he talked to me, and it became the source of the first book on Lyndon Johnson. And then after that, what happened is the Kennedy family had saved everything, it turned out. They, like Dick, were even more pack rats than Dick in some ways. And I found out that there were 50 cartons of material that were at the Kennedy Library that had belonged to Joe and Rose Kennedy, and that they'd saved every letter they'd written, every dance card, every movie place they went, and they were just being sent to the Kennedy Library. And because my husband knew the Kennedy family, they gave me access to those papers. So that became the Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys. And then after that, I thought, well, now what am I going to do next? I've had this guy I knew well, Lyndon Johnson. I had these special papers that I was lucky to have for the second book. Can I really write a book from scratch? It was kind of scary. And I always was interested in World War II and in Franklin Roosevelt, but so many books had been written about both World War II and Franklin Roosevelt. So it took me a while to figure out what could I do if I want to study that. And I was the one who decided that I wanted it to be Eleanor and Franklin, because I'd love to live with Eleanor for a period. You live with these people. It took me longer to write about World War II than it took the war to be fought. So you have to really want, the most important thing is I want to live with that person. I could never write about somebody. I could never write about Mussolini or Stalin or Hitler. I respect my fellow historians who can do it, but I want to wake up basically liking the person, basically respecting them. They're going to disappoint you always. They're going to be caught in the context of their times, but at least I want to feel like I'll enjoy them. And so I was able to come up with Eleanor and Franklin and the home front during World War II rather than the war front. And then that made me feel I could contribute something from all these thousands of books. Then after that, doing World War II and this wonderfully interesting period of time with these two great characters, then I thought, well, who's even more than that? And there's old Abe Lincoln out there. It's like the Moby Dick for historians, but with 16,000 books already written about him. And that was really scary. So I started thinking, well, what's going to be my angle on this? And I thought maybe, well, I'll write about Mary and Abe. But then I was 2 years into the book, and I realized she couldn't tell the public side of the story. Eleanor was everywhere I wanted her to be. She's creating daycare centers. She's dealing with civil rights. She's having only females come to her press conferences so that an entire generation of female journalists can get their whole start because of Eleanor Roosevelt's press conference. She's perfect for me. But Mary was not going to be able to be in the central moments that I needed her to be. So I luckily went up to Auburn, New York, and where Seward, his Secretary of State, came from. And I went to his house. And his house, I love presidential houses or people's houses, even more than sometimes you can get in the actual library. You can find in the houses a feeling of how they must have lived. And they had saved everything Seward had. And he had 1,000 letters to his wife, I found out. And so I thought, oh, this is getting interesting. And then I realized that Chase, I went and found him, and that he had sent hundreds of letters to his daughter and kept a diary. And then I found out that Bates, the other guy in the cabinet, had also kept a diary and wrote letters. And so I came up with the idea of doing Lincoln and his cabinet, and so that at least it could be something different, because then they could all have reflections on him. And then I could get my guy Lincoln in the midst of it and feel a sense of confidence that maybe I'd have something to say to him about him that hadn't before. Then what happened is the other period of time I was really interested in after that was the progressive era, because I taught a seminar at Harvard on that progressive era. And again, so many books on Teddy Roosevelt. A new one had come out, well, new, like 20 years before I started this one, new in my terms, cycle book on him. So I decided that I would not just do him, but I started finding out about William Howard Taft, who was one of his great friends, who he ends up running against in 1912, and they wrote letters to each other all the time. Letters have sort of been a part of it now that I think about it, so it became Teddy and Taft, but then even more, I was so interested in the journalists at the turn of the 20th century, the progressive journalists who were able to set the documents that created the pressure for reform, and so it becomes the golden age of journalism at the same time. And then finally, what happened is each time I finished one of these books, I'd have to move my guy's books out of my study and put them in another part of the house in order to make room for the new guy coming into my study. And I always felt guilty that I was leaving a boyfriend behind. So finally I decided, well, what if I write a book directly on leadership and all 4 guys can be there at the same time? Then I won't have to feel guilty. And I had, even though leadership had been part of the other books were their families, and it was much more sprawling. So this could be a laser focus on their leadership and where their qualities of empathy and humility and living through adversity and accessibility came from. And so now the guy I'm writing about is my guy, Richard N. Goodwin. And so hoping that I was trying to help him with a book before he died that would have been from these boxes that we were going through. And then after he died, now it's going to be me and him together going through the 60s. So it's a strange thing to be able to know. And he kept as much stuff as I found in my presidential libraries. And just to be able to write him keeps him in my life again even longer and longer. So it's going to take a while.
Doris, I want to say thank you, because the first time that I approached Doris about the idea of creating something that would be named for her and Dick, you were definitely ambivalent about it, right? She's a very modest person. She wasn't sure she was comfortable with that idea. But ultimately, I think the strength of your connection to Concord, your love for the community, and your desire to maintain a connection is what I think turned the tide and really opened your mind to it. And I just think we are all so blessed to have here in our midst one of the great historians and writers of the last century, to be surrounded by her books and her library, and to have this opportunity to hear from you in such an intimate way is really special, and I hope you'll come back and visit often. So thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.